Support for Amplified Voices comes from the Restorative Action Foundation. Learn more at restorativeactionalliance.org.
Everyone has a voice, a story to tell. Some are marginalized and muted. What if there were a way to amplify those stories? To have conversations with real people in real communities? A way to help them step into the power of their lived experience. Welcome to Amplified Voices, a podcast lifting the experiences of people and families impacted by the criminal legal system. Together, we can create positive change for everyone.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Amplified Voices. I'm your host, Jason, here with my co-host, Amber. Hi, Amber.
Hi, Jason.
And today we have Melissa Tanis. Good morning, Melissa.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Good morning, Melissa.
Great to have you here. So our question is going to be the same that we've been asking all of our guests. And that is, could you tell us a little bit about your life before your involvement with the criminal legal system and what happened that brought you into it?
But yeah, I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, and I live in New York City.
That must have been a culture shock right there.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up kind of always loving big cities, and I always wanted to live in New York, which is like kind of cliche, but my mom was from the Washington, D.C. area, so we would go there all the time, and I always loved riding on the subway and all of that. And so it wasn't too much of a culture shock for me, actually, because we had moved around a lot as well. So I've lived in I think 8 different states. So
Melissa, you sound a little bit like me. I moved around quite a bit as a child and actually into my adult life as well. So I hear you.
yeah, it was rough at first, but you definitely get used to it. And I think that helped me to be able to move to New York by myself and be somewhat okay.
Yeah.
It's funny because when you said before you got involvement in the legal system, and I don't really remember much of life before that because my dad went to prison when I was 5. So I don't really have much recollection of life before having some sort of contact with the criminal legal system. We were a typical, I guess, Midwest family. I have 2 older sisters and a younger brother, and my dad was working in computer engineering at the time. And so he had a good job and we had a pretty solid life from what I could tell as a kid. So then, yeah, a lot of that was imploded when he was arrested and then eventually sent to prison.
Do you remember how your life changed at that point as a kid?
Yeah, I mean, I lost all of my best friends. So the victims of my dad's crime were people who were mine and my sister's closest friends. And I didn't quite understand why we weren't allowed to have contact with them. And then obviously my mom became a single mom, had to go back to school, and she became a teacher and then, was raising 4 kids on a teacher's salary. And so, we struggled financially from then on out. And I was aware of that as a kid. I mean, it was probably the single most defining moment of my childhood that I remember. I don't remember much more before that or even around that time sometimes.
Did you continue to have contact with your father?
I didn't, no. We only went to go see him a couple of times when he was awaiting trial. And I think maybe once after he was sentenced, but we had contact cut off with him pretty soon after he was arrested.
First, I just want to acknowledge and say that I'm sorry that happened to you. At 5 years old, I can only imagine what you were thinking or able to understand and how your life significantly changed. You mentioned that after that, there were a lot of things that happened with your family and a lot of things that your mom had to take on. Could you tell us a little bit about, as you were going through this, did this affect her ability because she was working so much to be available for you? What did that feel like in terms of your family dynamic?
I think because she was a teacher and she worked a teacher's schedule, for the most part, she was able to be around in the evenings, which my dad actually wasn't as much. And she took on a lot. I mean, I think she's a very strong person, and I learned from a young age how to be an independent woman from her. She took on a lot, and she also had some friends that sort of helped with babysitting and all of that. So she had a good support system around her, which I know is not typical for most people, sadly, when someone goes to prison. So I think that was really helpful. I forgot to mention also, though, that one of the other big things that happened around that time was that when he went to prison, me and my siblings were taken away from my mom for a little bit by Child Protective Services. and were put in the foster care system for a little bit, where we went to a couple of different homes, stayed in a children's home for a little while. And that was when I was about 5. So that was really rough. Having my dad taken away and then being taken away from my mom, who didn't have anything to do with what happened, but they were investigating her, I guess, for that time period. So I think that instability caused us to be a little bit even more like close to each other and also close to my mom and reliant on her.
Were you kept together?
Surprisingly so. My oldest sister kind of had a rough time when the police came to our house. So she didn't initially come with us because she kind of fought it. And so they took us first and then she met up with us later. But as far as I can remember, for the most part, we were all kept together and went to each foster home, which at the time I didn't understand what that meant. Like I was like, oh, I'm just going to these random strangers' houses. I don't really know why. I didn't get until later on that like, oh, you go to foster homes because those people potentially could adopt you if something were to happen, like it didn't register for me at the time that that was a potential risk.
I've got a couple questions. One is about when did you finally get brought together with your mother again? And the other question is, we had a guest recently who talked about the way adults, and particularly teachers, treated her with an incarcerated parent. Did you experience any type of prejudice against you from the adult community throughout all of this?
Yeah. So the first question, I think it was only like a week or two. Thank goodness. I mean, in my mind, it felt like so much longer. And then there's not any particular instances where I felt like someone, because we didn't really talk about it. I didn't really share with my teachers or my classmates that that was happening. And I remember around the time that it was happening, being called out in front of my whole entire class. And, obviously that's like a scary thing to happen when you're a kid. And then I also went to go see the school counselor a lot and went to counseling when I was a kid. And I think that it was just more of the fact that it was like this kind of silent thing for me that I didn't really tell anybody. So I didn't really experience any sort of bad experiences from like teachers and stuff. But I also wish that some of them knew, even after it happened, because I had moments in elementary school when I wasn't the greatest student for a teacher to have. And I know a lot of that was, just acting out from a lot of the trauma that I experienced as a child. And so obviously I'm not developed enough at that age to be able to tell a teacher that. So just wish that some of them had that understanding of what had gone on in my life.
Sure.
Yeah. How about like aunts and uncles? Were they supportive?
My mom's side of the family, I think, was very supportive of her. My mom's very close with all of her siblings, but it was just somewhat of this unspoken thing sometimes, especially with my friends. My dad was convicted of child sexual abuse against my childhood best friends. And so seeing them and being around them, I instantly felt this sense of shame or guilt or feeling that like my presence is hurting somebody else, even though I didn't do anything wrong. You carry that guilt as a family. My mom felt that not from her own family, but just generally, like this underlying feeling kind of all the time. And again, I was a kid, so I didn't fully understand what happened. I didn't really get the like intensity of it until later. I just knew that something bad went on.
That's a whole lot of trauma at an early age. And to have to feel that guilt on top of it, I'm assuming you didn't really process those feelings until later in adulthood, would be my guess.
Yeah.
How long was your father sentenced?
He was sentenced to a maximum of 50 years.
50.
50. Yeah.
In some ways, it feels a lot like because of what happened, your whole family, in essence, was branded or felt criminalized for things that one member of the family did. Does that feel accurate?
Yeah. And like I said, even if someone didn't explicitly say it, it's just like a thing that you carry with you.
Right.
Inevitably for everyone involved, my mom, me, anyone else, I had nothing to do with it, but I couldn't stop it. I didn't know what was going on, obviously, but like you carry that guilt of like, what if I could have done something? What if I could have protected my friends as a 5-year-old,
Right, right. And that's a very large burden for a child to bear, for sure.
Yeah.
And so tell us a little bit about your recollection in terms of the process. Obviously, there's some way that this came to light and, your father was arrested. Is that how that went, or you're not sure? And then what was the time frame between the time that this came to light and the time that he may have gone to a period of incarceration?
I have not much recollection just because trauma wipes out some of your memories sometimes. The time that I was aware that something was happening was when the police came to our house and took us away the first time from my mom. And then, I was kind of aware that my mom was going to court and that she wasn't bringing us. And I realized later that the reason why we weren't really a part of that process was because my dad pleaded guilty. He didn't go to trial. So I knew that that was happening. And then we went to go visit him in jail. And all I remember is the vending machines because I was like, oh, I get to get candy. Like that got me through the terror of being in a jail visiting room.
What year were we talking about?
Like the arrest, him pleading guilty, going to prison, that happened over about a year and a half, 2-year span from like 1993 to 1995.
I think in terms of, we're just trying to get a sense of the timeline and what was going on in your life. You're trying to go through school, you're trying to, just live a normal life. Meanwhile, mom's going to court, you're not quite sure what is happening, but you know that your life has essentially been changed forever because your dad's no longer in the picture. There's this sense of shame, and your mom's going through all of these things, having to raise 4 children on her own. So tell us a little bit about that. What were the kind of things that you liked to do when you were that age? What was your favorite subject in school? Tell us a little bit about those things.
When I was younger, I loved sports and still kind of do. I played soccer a lot. I could do it through like the YMCA, and that was free for my mom to put us in. And so I played soccer a lot growing up. I loved dance. I didn't actually get to do much of it just because I think we started it, but my mom couldn't afford to do too much extracurricular stuff with us, timing and financial wise. But yeah, I really loved athletics. And in school, history maybe was one of my favorites. And anytime we had something like more creative too, I loved doing like theater. I did some like plays when I was a kid, and that was always fun for me, which is interesting because, we'll get to this eventually, but my dad was a part of the Shakespeare Behind Bars program when he was incarcerated. He was also in the Shakespeare Behind Bars documentary. I don't know if you've seen that, but he was in that. So I actually loved Shakespeare growing up, and this was while I didn't have a relationship with him. And so that was something that I really felt connected to him through, was doing acting and drama and all of that.
And, the thing about the creative arts and drama and sports, for that matter, is it really fosters belonging. It fosters positive teamwork skills and theater creative thinking. So I would imagine that those things were really important to you as you were trying to cope with a very changing world.
Yeah, and they still are. I'm actually currently an aerialist. I do like circus aerial stuff.
Wow.
Nice.
That's been a huge outlet for me, especially recently, to just like be creative, but also, to have a way to express what I've been through without having to talk about it.
Right.
So what was it like as you're growing up? You start going through the different stages and you turn on the TV and you see Megan's Law, unfortunate killing of Megan Kenka and all that was in that time frame. And so a lot of things were going on. How did that affect you every time you heard some of that, or you were in a room when it's being discussed?
From what I can remember as a kid, like I even remember when it kind of hit me what had happened. I think I was around like 10 or so years old. And I remember even thinking then, like, I don't feel like prison is the place that he needs to be. If that's truly what he did and what happened, then why is he just being put in a cell? Like, why isn't he being given any sort of treatment to actually help him? I felt that even intuitively as a child. And then I remember also, even before I had a relationship with him, so I didn't reconnect with him until I was an adult. And even before that, even before I knew him personally, when I would see friends post stuff on Facebook, like I explicitly remember someone that I went to high school with posting some sort of meme about how, I won't repeat it word for word, but just essentially how people who harm children don't deserve to live. And I remember just having this visceral reaction to it of just like, you're talking about my dad. And I didn't even have a relationship with him at that point to be even that defensive of him, I guess. I think it was an appropriate response, but that was like my first reaction, even though I didn't even know him. And just like wishing that people knew that when you're saying those things, like you're talking about actual people and actual people like family members. The 90s was definitely known as like a tough on crime era. And I feel like I learned more about that as an adult. As a kid, I didn't really hear too much. I was pretty sheltered from a lot of the stuff. My mom tried really hard to protect us from a lot of the stuff that was going on. And in a way that was good. And in a way, it also made it to where I didn't really have a say sometimes in what I wanted with my relationship with my dad. But, I think she was doing the best that she thought that she could do. But I think that also just generally when no one wants to talk about it because it's such a taboo subject, it just created this sense of like, we just don't talk about that.
Right.
I'm thinking of the Encanto song.
Right. We don't talk about Bruno.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those things.
What facilitated you getting back in touch with your father and having a relationship with him?
So when I was in undergrad, I just had this moment of realizing that I didn't even know if he was still alive. And I think because I didn't really have the option of having a relationship with him growing up, I just thought when someone goes to prison, you just cut off your family member. And then it just dawned on me when I was an adult, I'm older now. I can make my own decisions about what I want with my relationship with my dad. And so I realized that I didn't even know if he was still alive. So I started Googling him, and it kind of sent me down this rabbit hole of realizing that he was in the Shakespeare Behind Bars program, and that there was also a documentary about it, and that there was a way for me to see him right then and there. And that was like very overwhelming. And I read a ton of reviews about the film. I read about him. A lot of people really loved him in the film because the way that they do it is they don't ask them what it is that they're convicted of. They don't put it under their name in the film, like an identifier to them. They just talk to them as they are and then allow them to talk about it if they want to talk about it, but they don't specifically ask about any of their crimes. And I think a lot of people really got to know my dad and loved what he had to say in the film. And then when they did find out what he was convicted of, it was like I was inspired by someone that did such harmful things. And I think that that's such a good place for people to be in, to have to wrestle with the fact that people are so much more complex than we think that they are. And so I read a lot about that and just kind of prepped myself for watching it. And then I watched the film, and he says multiple times in the film, people who need mercy the most are the ones who get it the least. And talking about forgiveness and how much he desires to be able to repair the harm that he had caused. And that made me feel, one, like I forgive him, and it would be wrong for me to withhold that from him, to not let him know.
How many boxes of tissues did you go through at that moment?
Oh my goodness.
I need tissues right now. Like, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just the idea that you had that immediate availability to see him through this film and through this program and prep yourself to say, okay, this is my dad. There's a possibility to reconnect, and I'm able to see the accountability that he's experienced. That's an amazing gift.
Yeah. I'm like forever grateful to Shakespeare Behind Bars, to the documentary, like all of that, because it opened that door for me to be able to see his remorse, to see him, and to also do it in sort of a step-by-step process, and being able to have that sort of moment of getting to see where he was at. I mean, the film was made in like 2002, but like it was so good to have that because it was such a monumental moment. I'm just sitting in my dorm room by myself, like watching this film, just being like, my life is probably going to change. And when I finished the film, I was like, I have to write him. I have to reconnect with him. And it took me about 2 years after that to do it, because I told a couple people, because obviously it was like a hard thing to keep to myself, but just to get people's, advice and feelings. And I told one of my aunts, because I was living with her for a summer, and she was, supportive of me. And I just was trying to work up the courage, I guess. And also, I knew this was going to be a thing that sort of blew up my family a little bit. And so when to tell my mom, when to tell my sibling, like it was a lot. But when I moved to New York, I moved here in 2013. Less than a year later, I was again telling a friend, I've been having these thoughts of writing my dad. And she was like, that's so cool. That's so awesome. Like, wow, that's amazing that you want to reconnect with him. And when I left her apartment, I felt bad. I was like, why do I keep telling people that I'm going to do this? But I'm like, I haven't done it yet. So I can't just keep acting like I'm doing this great thing when I haven't actually done it. I need to actually do it and not just tell people I'm doing it.
What's the year?
This was 2014.
2014. You're in New York. He's in Kentucky.
He's still incarcerated in Kentucky. I believe he received my letter, or I received his letter back, my first letter that I sent him, on Valentine's Day of 2014. And he wrote back immediately.
So you write a letter and it's still not a real thing. You get the letter back. What is that moment like?
I think that was kind of what helped me to write the letter because I was like, okay, you don't need to make this into anything yet. If you write him and he doesn't even write you back, you know. But then my deal to myself was like, if he writes back and if this starts a relationship, obviously then I have to let people know that he's back in my life. And so he wrote me back and the letter was kind of everything that I expected it to be. It was a mix of being incredibly grateful that after 20 years, one of his kids reached out to him, but then also a mix of feeling scared, a little skeptical. Like, are you just reaching out because you need some closure? Do you actually want a relationship with me? And then also just some of the pain that he felt from being rejected for all of these years and not having a relationship with his kids. And so it was a lot. It was a mix of all of those emotions. And I think that actually was really helpful for me because if it had just been like, oh my goodness, I'm so glad that you reached out, then it would have felt a little disingenuous. Like I felt like that was him being, here's all of me. And if you want to have a relationship with the complicated person that I am, here you go. And I was like, okay, I'm ready for that. Again, that was a moment of me knowing my life's going to change from here on out. And then soon after that, in May was the first time I went to go visit him in prison. So I reconnected also with my dad's side of the family, with my aunt and my uncle and his parents. And she was really helpful in kind of telling me what to expect because I hadn't been to a prison since I was a kid. And so she was very helpful in like, here's all the process that you have to go through so that I wasn't like worried about I still was worried about the actual process. Like, would they even let me in? What if something went wrong? You know, little things like they maybe take out my nose ring, like stuff like that.
You were coming from New York?
Right.
Like you were traveling multiple states to make this visit. So if it was like, oh, you're wearing the wrong spaghetti straps.
Right.
Or whatever to be rejected, that would have been very traumatic.
Right, because they have no idea the monumental thing that's about to happen. Like they had no idea that this was the first time I'd seen my dad in 20 years. I also didn't know how long we were going to have. Thank goodness, because I came from such a long way, they let me stay the whole time. So I was there for about 6 hours.
Wow.
So that was really good. But again, literally anything can happen on a visit. You never know. If I had gone regularly, I'm sure eventually there would have been a time when they would have been like, nope, you can't come in. But it was always nerve-wracking. You just never know if they're going to get mad about the smallest little thing. So I was nervous about that throughout the process. And then, you know, sitting in like the waiting room and I was just a ball of nerves. I was like, am I even going to recognize him? It's just so weird to be like, this is my dad, but I'm worried that I would not even know who he was or where he was sitting. But when I saw him, it was like this familiarity of, you know, that that's your dad, even if he looks different than he did, even in the documentary.
Yeah, you'd seen him in the documentary, but had you sent him any pictures? Had he seen you at all?
I don't think up until that point I had sent him any pictures.
So, I mean, the last time he saw you, you were 5 years old.
Yeah.
Wow. So tell us a little bit about what the visit was like.
It was really good. I remember just feeling like this is such a huge moment. And literally no one in this room knows that. And we're literally having the worst room possible, like dark, bland visiting room where we're eating chips for lunch, you know, like it just felt so much bigger than, I don't know, but it was obviously big for both of us. And the visit was mainly just us trying to catch up on 20 years of like kind of missing out on each other's life, but then also was so clear. My dad would say all the time, I had no hand in raising you. And somehow you turned out to be the kid that I wish that I would have raised. And I think that's because I didn't realize until I met him. I think I kind of knew this growing up, but like my personality, I got so much of it from him. I look a lot like my mom, but we have very different personalities. And so when I met my dad, it was like, okay, now I understand myself even better. And then also there was just a connection that's there just because you're blood related. It wasn't awkward for us, I don't think. I mean, it was intense and there was a lot of like growth that had to happen, but it was also kind of like, yeah, of course, you're my dad. Of course you understand me. But then there was a lot of weirdness of like, but you don't know anything about my life and I don't know anything about yours. Like even stuff about him that I didn't know as a kid, I'm learning about where he grew up because I didn't know that when I was 5, you know, or how he even met my mom. There's so much I didn't know. And then yet there was so much that was familiar to me.
But you had to compress all of that into this one quick meeting. When you say 20 years, those are a big 20 years.
Those are like 20 years of development and all of these major milestones. So it was a really good time of connecting and trying to catch up. You're in a situation that obviously felt a little bit beneath the monumental nature of this visit. It's like, okay, we're eating chips, we're sitting in a room. Was it a visitation room where there were like other people around you and you're trying to focus on each other? And it feels like a cafeteria type of situation.
Yeah. They didn't tell me, oh, because you traveled this way, we'll give you the whole time. We just were constantly kind of waiting for them to potentially interrupt the visit.
Wow.
Wow.
Or for anything to interrupt the visit. I mean, obviously they do count at some point.
Could be a lockdown.
Exactly. You never know. He was even worried when I was coming there because he had a lot of medical problems. And actually, in the second letter that he ever sent back to me, I found out that around the time that I was watching the documentary and thinking about writing him, he almost died from something that ruptured. My sisters are both nurses. And when I told them, they were like, most people don't survive that kind of thing.
Wow.
Learning about that was obviously devastating. He had a doctor's appointment set up for potentially around that time. And so he was so worried that he was just going to get called out that day that I was going to be there. And to talk about the prison medical system, he didn't get the appointment until about a year later. So they just never know when they're going to pull them out for those things.
So you just brought up your sisters. Were you talking with them and with your mother about what's going on? And did they eventually reconcile with your father through you?
Yeah, so they all knew. I told my siblings before I wrote the letter because I felt a little more comfortable telling them. And then my mom knew after, I decided, hey, he wrote me back and we're going to have this relationship. Yeah, she knew I was going to visit him, and so did my siblings. I was letting my siblings in on a little bit of the journey just so that they had the option if they ever wanted to reach out to him. But I mean, we're at very different stages. My brother was 2, so actually remembers nothing. And then my sister was 8. So she was a little bit more in a different development stage where she remembers everything. So we all had different experiences with it. And so I kind of just tried to create space for them to work through whatever it was that this was bringing up, and to be there to support any relationship that they did want to have with him, whether it was just writing him one letter, all of those things. And some of them did get in contact with him here or there. But then about a year and a half after I first wrote him, we found out his cancer had returned and he was given 6 months to 2 years left to live. So when that happened, my siblings were all like, okay, I want to go see him. So I was able to help facilitate a visit between all of my siblings and him before he passed away in 2016.
So you had a period of about 2 years that you were able to get to know him.
Yeah. So when I found out about his cancer, it was again that feeling of like, how do I fit in 20 years, like missing out on this person and him missing out on my life in this short amount of time. And like every time he would call, I just constantly felt this pressure of how do I utilize this time because we have such a limited contact and you never know when your last time is going to be. And like, do I just tell him about my day? Is that a waste of a call? Or is that just, going on like a normal relationship? It was so much pressure for me to try and figure out how to fit in what I wanted to fit in, because not necessarily for like closure for me, but just like to continue to have some semblance of a relationship with him.
First of all, I'm so sorry that you lost your father. I'm so sorry that you lost 20 years of connecting with him. The only word I can come up with is trauma that you've been through, and it's just awful. I'm glad you had that opportunity to reconnect with him and to have a relationship with him. When he was sick and he was incarcerated, what was that like for him and for you?
That was really rough because, like I said, he didn't necessarily always get his appointments when they said that they were going to have them. It was hard as a family member because even though I was on his list of people who could know about his medical issues, they don't really tell you much because they don't know and they also don't care. Oftentimes when you call, it's very rare that you're going to get someone who's actually going to like care and track down something. They're just going to tell you, oh, he's fine, which they literally did about a week before he passed away. My aunt called to be like, do we need to schedule an emergency visit? How do we do that? And they were like, he's fine. They're taking care of him. Literally, I'm like, you don't even know who we're talking about, probably.
Right. They have the answer before the question was even asked. And so in the state where he was incarcerated, or if it was a federal charge, were there any opportunities for compassionate release?
So he was incarcerated in Kentucky. It was a state prison, and he had applied for clemency. I had written a letter of support, but knew that that probably wasn't going to happen. I knew by the nature of his crime that he most likely was not going to get clemency. He had been denied parole in 2007, and in Kentucky, they can give you up to 10 years between parole hearings. So he died in 2016. he would have gone before the parole board again in 2017. He could not apply for compassionate release because of the nature of his crime. So there were literally no options for us really to get him home, which is a large part of why I do work around parole and clemency to increase opportunities for people to come home, because so many people are denied or just excluded based on the nature of their crime. And then you miss stories like my dad, where towards the end of his life, he was in a wheelchair. I couldn't go see him because he couldn't even come to the visiting room. He couldn't even talk on the phone. Who is he going to harm if he were to just come home to his family for the last month of his life?
Did he go through treatment programs throughout the time that he was incarcerated?
Yeah, he did. Part of why I believe he was denied parole was because some of them he didn't finish because he felt like they weren't helpful to him, because they very much pigeonholed him into like, you have to admit that you're these things. You have to put yourself in this box of what it means to be, quote unquote, a sex offender. And he just felt like that wasn't helpful for him understanding why he did what he did. He actually was able to do that more through Shakespeare Behind Bars and through like some writing programs that he did. And I got to read a lot of that stuff of his own processing of why he did what he did, what led him to that, which I thought was very profound.
People have this image that somebody who's been given the label sex offender, that they all fit into one box, that they all fit one criteria. Mm-hmm. And they forget that the human experience is so different for so many different people. And there's so many different reasons and issues that could lead someone to offend, and that people aren't the worst thing that they ever did. Mm-hmm. And so I'm glad that you had the opportunity to get to understand some of the motivators for your father and his own journey and what he went through. And I think that was a gift that you would never have gotten if you didn't get to know him again. Otherwise, you would have that image of him as well, probably, as the rest of the community.
Melissa, I'm really glad that you shared that with us about the treatment, because we do know that when people are undergoing treatment, it really has to be based on their needs, or it's not treatment, right? And so what we do here a lot is when treatment of all kinds that are attached to carceral systems and fit into that box of a carceral approach that is very blanket, it's very impersonal. It's like, okay, you have to do this, this, and this. And the goal is not to help you work through the root cause of your issues. The goal is to say, you're a monster, and you have to constantly think that you are a monster and what you have to do to not be a monster. When a lot of the reasons, again, like Jason alluded to, that people commit offenses of all kinds, any type of offense that somebody commits, it's based on different things that have happened in their life and inadequate coping mechanisms. So the reason that people commit sex offenses are the same reasons that people commit any offense. Mm-hmm. We just have such a view and a repulsion for sexual offenses, as we should. We can't condone harm. We want to actually break those cycles. So I really appreciate you sharing the part about the treatment, because we need to be looking at when treatment is treatment or when treatment is additional punishment.
Mm-hmm.
We can't have compassion for someone because of the nature of the crime. It's like the crime is not the person, right? We can't have compassion for somebody. There should be no exclusion for compassion. We have a cruel system that allowed your father to pass away behind bars instead of being with his family, who would, after all this time, been there to support him and maybe make it a little less painful for the transition.
Right.
Right. So, Melissa, you alluded to the work that you're doing in terms of all of the things that you learned from your lived experience and what would have made a difference for your family. So you are doing some advocacy work. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because I know you're doing some really great stuff.
Yeah. So I work at the Center for Justice at Columbia University.
Ooh, I'm an alum.
I am also an alum. I graduated with my master's there in 2019, which I think my dad would have been very proud about. He didn't get to hear that I got accepted, but I'm sure he would be very happy. Yeah, I work at the Center for Justice, and then I also work with the Release Aging People in Prison campaign, which I actually did my field placements for grad school at both of those organizations. And all of the people there are people that I love and have become family to me and have supported me through everything that happened. So actually, when my dad passed away, I was a fellow at the Center for Justice. They have a yearly conference called the Beyond the Bars Conference, and they have a fellowship called Beyond the Bars, and I was a Beyond the Bars fellow. And so just having people who were compassionate towards me when that happened and didn't act weird or didn't know how to like respond when someone dies in prison. It was like they all knew, how to respond. And that was so great to have people that understood that. So I've been working with them and on the issue of parole and aging in prison for about 4 or 5 years. And I love it for many of the reasons you all just stated about how no one should be excluded from any type of reforms that people put forth, any type of compassionate release. And that is something that the Release Aging People in Prison campaign adamantly will not compromise on. So we have 2 bills currently that we're advocating for. One is called elder parole, which would give people who are 55 and older an opportunity for parole. And again, is not based on any exclusions. Anybody who is 55 and has served at least 15 years of their sentence will have an opportunity for parole. And then the other one is called fair and timely parole, which again addresses some of the things you just brought up, Jason, about the nature of the crime, because often what happens is people are denied parole solely on the nature of their crime. And so they just copy and paste the language about you were denied because your release would deprecate the nature of the offense. And then they're denied parole over and over and over and over and over again for that reason. And there's literally nothing they can do to change that. So what's the point of parole if we're just going to deny people based on the nature of their crime? The only thing that they cannot change. The point of parole is to see who people are today. So the fair and timely parole bill would require them to assess more than just the nature of the crime and have to give reasons other than the nature of their crime for why they denied somebody. And if they cannot prove that they are a current risk to public safety, then the understanding is that that person should be released. So I think those 2 bills in conjunction really address the issue of people being denied parole multiple times, well past their minimum sentence, getting 20 years tacked on to their minimum sentence just through parole denials. But then also people who won't even see a parole board, we call them virtual life sentences. In New York, like 50 years to life is 50 is the minimum sentence they have to serve before they even see a parole board. We know someone inside right now who has 62 years to life. So they are given a death sentence, essentially. That's what's happening. So yes, we got rid of the death penalty in New York, but these are death sentences for people. So elder parole will make sure that they can actually be seen by a parole board. It's not an automatic release, but they're going through the process that everyone else is and are given some sort of opportunity and some sort of hope that eventually they could come home and that their case is seen.
When we're talking about all this, COVID has certainly ratcheted up the intensity because we have people who are dying. I know in Connecticut, the number is around the 30 mark at this point. In New York, it's a much bigger state. Do you have those stats?
Yeah. So when COVID hit, we really ramped up our efforts around clemency because that's a way that the governor could very easily protect people and let people out. And Cuomo did nothing until his last days in office. He granted 10 clemencies, but there are almost 40,000 people who are incarcerated. And then Hochul at the end of the year granted 1.
This seems to be bipartisan.
Yeah.
The humanity seems to go out the window.
Yeah.
When we start talking about this issue.
Yeah, no, and it's been really upsetting. And, family members are just constantly on edge, constantly anxious about their family members behind bars because having someone who's having medical issues inside, if they can't contact you, you know nothing. And it's just so torturous to family members to do that to them. Not only not to just release their family members, but to give them no information about where their clemency application is, anything. So we've seen a lot of deaths behind bars. There's been 5 within the last month that we know of that are COVID related. The Release Aging People in Prison campaign always sends out a statement anytime somebody dies. And we're doing these social media actions every time it happens because it's been happening so frequently. But then in general, I was actually part of a report that my work released in October about just generally the number of deaths behind bars in New York State since 1976, which is when they had data for. And we found that every 3 days, someone dies in a New York State prison.
Every 3 days.
Every 3 days.
And I believe that I read somewhere that the average age of death in New York State prisons is 58.
Oh, boy.
Yep.
When they release the information, do they always attach a crime to it as well? Like John Doe was convicted of XYZ and he passed away.
For like COVID related deaths, they just have this website where they're just keeping track of numbers. And for I think 9 months, the number didn't change. So I believe it's very inaccurate.
Right.
But the number just goes up. And then we know about it because we have people inside who tell us.
Sure.
But then when we release, a statement about, of course, there's people that are going to be looking up what the person was convicted of and saying that that's a reason why we shouldn't care about them dying, which is absolutely ridiculous. But they don't even care enough to say the person's name. It's just a number tracker.
Yeah, in Connecticut, when they put out a release, they'll say exactly the nature of the crime, even if it was 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's just absurd because, like you said, they could have had a big role in Shakespeare behind bars or anything like that. And none of that mattered.
Right.
You mentioned that the elder parole bill says 55 if you've served 15 years of your sentence. And I want to talk a little bit about the fact that that 15 years actually comes from data. What we see is that 15 years after the commission of a crime or living in the community, crime-free, or periods of rehabilitation, people are no more likely to commit a new crime. So I think that the work that you guys are doing is amazing. And I appreciate that there are many, many campaigns out there that look at the nature of the crime as a criteria for relief, right? So even in the reform space, we do see exclusions. So that is one of the things that is, I would say, unique and is becoming a conversation that people are having more often. Again, like you said, you cannot change the nature of a crime that has been committed. Violence happens in context, and violence is an action and a point in time. It is not a person.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not an automatic. It's just leveling the playing field, right? Because it's not like you automatically are being released. It's just for a chance.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's being asked for.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you sharing that. And we will put in the podcast notes how people can get involved in some of these efforts that clearly would have made a huge difference for your family.
Mm-hmm.
So as we're getting to the end of our time together, I want to ask you, and this is one of the questions that I really love to ask people because I always find it so interesting. If you could talk to someone out there who's listening to our podcast and they were going through a similar situation as you, and you could give them one piece of advice or say one thing to them, what would it be?
That's a big one. I mean, I think first would be that the system wants you to believe that you're isolated and alone. But there are so many people, even just by the numbers of people that we know who are incarcerated in this country, there's so many people who are going through similar things. So if you can find connection to groups that are advocating for people to really be released, or even just support groups of people who are going through a similar thing, that is so helpful. Around the time that my dad passed away, one of my friends, we became friends because I found out about her dad passing away in prison and being sort of a catalyst for a lot of this parole reform movement. And there was like an instant connection, and there always is. Even if we don't talk to each other for a while, we are always bound by this. And, trauma bonding can be sometimes not great, but sometimes it can be very, very helpful. And having her and having someone who knows exactly how I'm feeling, and I can tell that to her and she can tell that to me. And I'm like, I get it immediately. Having that is just so important. I also have so many friends through being a Beyond the Bars fellow, doing this work, who also have had parents who are incarcerated for violent crimes, who understand what it's like to constantly hear about our parents being left out of stuff, and to constantly hear about our parents being people thinking that they're monsters and us not believing that and feeling alone in that a lot of times. But then we have each other to be like, you're not alone. It's not ridiculous for you to want to still have a relationship with your parent. That is so important. And then I think also if you have the capacity, I mean, sometimes it's hard. I've had to take breaks from advocacy a lot just because it's very triggering. But being involved in making sure that other families don't go through what I go through is a way for me to process my grief and to also turn it into something that potentially spares other people from having to have the same kind of trauma. So getting connected to groups and also not letting them make us think that we're isolated, because when we come together and are actually building power together, that's when they're scared because they don't want us to fight back against the system. So get connected as much as you can. And I also want you to know that you're not weird for still caring about the person that you love, even when it seems like the majority of people don't believe this, still believing that they're a complicated human being that still deserves a base level of respect that everyone deserves. I think there's other people that believe that, and you're not alone in thinking that.
The word that's running through my head as you're talking is humanity. you've taken such an awful situation and you're bringing back a level of humanity and helping other people. And that's really commendable.
Thanks.
I'm so excited about the work that you're doing, and I'm so inspired by you and your story and really paving that pain into power, working with so many other people. And I thank you for joining us today. If you could tell a legislator what would have made a difference for your life, what would it be?
I mean, I do talk to legislators a lot, and sometimes they are great and sometimes they are not, especially when I share my story. I've had differing reactions, and people who, when they hear about what my dad was convicted of, automatically kind of shut down or are like, well, now I don't really agree with what you're saying, kind of thing. And that's been very harmful to me. So I guess when they're hearing people's stories, to keep an open mind and to keep looking at the humanity of people, and also realizing there are family members who care. But it would have just made a huge difference for me and my family, for my dad to just even have an opportunity to have his story heard. And not only his story, but ours as well. Like the fact that I didn't even get a say, that my aunt didn't even get a say what was happening to my dad. We just have to accept what is happening to us, even though we also are being harmed by the system. We also were harmed by him going to prison, but our story doesn't even get factored in at all. So just having an opportunity for our voices to be heard as well, I think would have been really helpful. And also just understanding that the binary that our system tries to create with victim and offender, or person who caused harm, person who was harmed, it's not like that. So many people are harmed by a situation. So many people are harmed by the system. And there's so many communities that are harmed by it as well. Like it goes beyond what we want to think are the groups of people that are harmed and that should be heard. And so expanding how we see a survivor, which oftentimes people who go to prison are also survivors themselves. So just taking all of that into context and not falling into the binary that people want you to believe that it's this side versus this side, because that's not the case.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for being here, for talking with us, for continuing to put yourself out there after having gone through this horrific experience. Hopefully people listen and will be moved by the story like we certainly were. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me and for listening and amplifying voices of people that often aren't heard.
Until next time, Amber.
We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Amplified Voices, a podcast lifting the experiences of people and families impacted by the criminal legal system. For more information, episodes, and podcast notes, visit amplifiedvoices.show.